Let me say first of all, I certainly understand the pecking order around this building. And so the first thing any House member should say after the Speaker addresses anybody is ditto. So what he said, okay? I'm on board with that. Please tell him so when you see him. I tell people often that, there's a difference between the Speaker of the House and Speaker Pro-Tem, and the major difference is that the Speaker of the House has a bathroom in his office. And the Speaker Pro-Tem's office used to be a bathroom. And that's literally the truth. I do want to comment on one thing he said when he talked about, with some passion and deservedly so, about teacher pay. I'd heard someone speculate earlier today that, well, maybe that was just an afterthought when the Speaker, in an interview, I think last week or week before, talked about teacher pay. Well, let me tell you, Philip Gunn does not operate on afterthoughts. And I think you heard that in his voice this morning. It is a serious proposal. It is something that we're going to work hard on, hope we can make happen. I knew he was going to speak in generalities, as he should, to a group like this. I want to talk to you very briefly about two focused things, about issues I think are likely to be high on the plate, if you will, not only in this session but going forward. Two very important things. The first of all will be the recommendations and hopefully legislation that will come out of our Corrections and Criminal Justice Task Force. If you've paid any attention to the news over the last few months, you know that a 21-member task force has been working to come forward with recommendations to fix what I have characterized and what I firmly believe is a broken system. We have a disconnect between our corrections system and our criminal justice system. 21 members, we've had judges, Department of Corrections officials, prosecutors, public defenders, inmate advocates, law enforcement people, everyone at the table. And these 21 people have worked hard, very hard, over the last few months. Commissioner Epps chaired that committee. And I think there was a high likelihood maybe that nothing would happen. When you get that many divergent views, you run a risk that there's not going to be any consensus. A beautiful thing did happen. I think there was real compromise, a real recognition that things need to change, and they're coming forward with a whole range of recommendations for changing the way we operate our corrections and our criminal justice system and making it a more just system. We know, and the number I think you hear is $266 million. We're on a path to increase our correction spending by an additional $266 million over the next 10 years if we do nothing. And we have now a system where judges have very little to say because of what we've done to dismantle our sentencing system. They have very little to say. Nobody really knows how long a sentence will last. We have a system where how long someone remains incarcerated depends largely on how much money the state has to pay to keep him or her there. Now, I would just suggest to you that any system that's designed that way is pretty much the definition of injustice. We've got to find a better way to do things, and we're working at that from both ends. One thing is there is and there will be a certainty of sentencing. We're not going back to any sort of 85% rule, which, by the way, has been dismantled for about 10 or 12 years now. And even after the dismantling and throughout that period of dismantling, we've had about a 17% increase in population growth in our system. But we are going to a system where we're relying on judges and prosecutors and what happens in the courtroom to have a real impact on how long a sentence will be. Now, the kick side of that is they've got to learn to trust the legislature, which is a difficult thing to do. The judiciary mistrusts our legislature, and for very good reason, because for about every other year at least, we've changed the rules. And the judges out there don't know what a sentence means, yet the people in their community that put them in office expect them to know why so-and-so's back on the streets. So we've got to build that trust. They've got to have a buy-in. By the same token, we've got to find ways that make sense. We have about half of our prisoners that are incarcerated now are nonviolent. We need to find alternatives, and we have some, house arrest, ISP, some alternative sentencing, drug courts, all these things that are available that the task force, again, this is kind of an omnibus sort of recommendation. It will be coming forward. I have very high hopes for it. I think it'll be a bipartisan supported effort, and I would encourage everyone here to take a real stake in that, because it's going to make a difference. When I go home, and when all our members go home, people talk about crime. We've got crime problems. When I come to the Capitol, people talk about we're spending way too much money on prisons. Well, they're both true, but you don't have to be a rocket surgeon To quote the speaker, you don't have to be a rocket surgeon to recognize that there's a tension there. All right, we've got to do a better job of, as Christopher Epps has said, deciding who we're afraid of and who we're mad about. You know, as far as who we actually incarcerate. So I ask you to help us with that. Very briefly, another big thing that we've instituted that's in process now, that I think you'll see some fruit born over the next few years, is a real effort at performance-based budgeting. We've signed up, the state of Mississippi has signed up with what's called Results First, which is a program that really is a system for budgeting performance that the Pew Institute has helped institute. We're one of about 20 states, I don't know the exact number, that are doing that. And the idea is a very simple one. It's really to quantify, to use evidence-based decision-making in your budgeting process. And you do that you do it both at a top-down and a bottom-up approach. The top-down is the legislature and state government decides what our strategic priorities are. And from the bottom down, we require state agencies, local governments, to give us the critical data, program-level data, that we got to feed in to make appropriate decisions. We do too much over here. And if you, in any sort of endeavor, if you don't really have data-driven metrics to tell you what the value for what you're spending, you do things based on how things feel. I'll give you a couple of examples. Corrections is one of these areas where it would be wonderfully, in fact, that's the very first area we're going to use for Results First. It's very much available for a performance-based sort of analysis and approach. But you remember the Scared Straight program? Somebody may be familiar with it. Scared Straight, the idea was to take kids to prison, they'd see how awful it was, they'd get scared and wouldn't go to prison. Well, it turns out not only was that a horrific waste of money, it didn't really keep any kid from doing that. It actually attracted some to the culture. They said, well, it's not so bad. I mean, honestly, the data has shown that. I mean, it's just a failure as a program, and a lot of money went into that. In a lot of states, it could have gone into things that work. And the idea of a performance-based budgeting model is to allow us to do that. Again, this is going to require a lot of buy-in from state agencies, from local governments. We're going to be asking them, frankly, we're going to be demanding of them, we are going to be mandating them to give us the data we need to drive this system, to give us the tools we have, or we'll need to have, to be able to make intelligent decisions about how we spend the money. Because the idea, obviously, is to spend money on something you know that's going to be effective, and not to spend money on something that isn't. That's going to be a multi-year effort. I do think also that's something that you'll see broad bipartisan support for. So I just wanted to put those two things on your radar screen, because I think there's things you're going to be hearing more about. The corrections and criminal justice reforms are going to be very significant. I think we're going to have important legislation this year. And then we're starting this performance-based budgeting process. The House and Senate and Governor are working together with that. And I think you'll see that bear great fruit over the next few years. And if somebody would just appreciate me for being leaner, this would just be a wonderful end of this day. So thank you so very much for being here.